During the Solomon Island campaigns, both American and Japanese navies suffered heavy losses. The majority of these ships sank around Guadalcanal, leading to the name Ironbottom Sound entering popular imagination. However, not every ship lost in the Solomons went down in Ironbottom Sound. There are notable exceptions, such as Hornet and Wasp. They are not the only examples either. Another famous ship in this regard is USS Helena, a ship that led a charmed life, at least around Guadalcanal. She escaped major damage of her own, even as other American ships were crippled around her. She did severe damage, in turn, to the Japanese. That luck would end up running out, though, in the Battle of Kula Gulf. Helena would be sent to the bottom, where her severely damaged wreck remains to this day. Let's take a look at that wreck now, after I briefly cover her final battle. This battle took place on July 6, 1943. Helena, with her sisters St. Louis and Honolulu, as well as some destroyers, engaged a group of Japanese destroyers. This battle was rather lopsided in gunpowder in favor of the Americans. The Japanese, however, retained their torpedoes. And with Helena's guns blasting away into the night, they had a clear target to aim for. The result would be Helena being hit by 3 torpedoes. At around 2 a.m., the first hit her bow on the port side. Helena's own motion twisted her damaged bow and tore it off, just ahead of her number 2 turret. 2 further torpedoes would hit her amidships, and it was these impacts that doomed the cruiser. After all, American cruisers had survived their bows being blown off. With the other 2 hits, in addition to the loss of her bow, Helena sank quickly. 168 of her crew were lost, either in the battle or in the immediate aftermath. Her wreck would remain hidden beneath the waves until it was discovered on April 11, 2018. Unsurprisingly for anyone watching these videos, Helena was found by RV Petrol on one of Paul Allen's expeditions. She is one of many ships found by that crew. The wreck is relatively shallow by the standards of most wrecks found by Petrol. Helena rests at 2,820 feet, or 860 meters. This relatively shallow depth is reflected in the larger amount of corrosion and sea life on her hulk. This is a direct contrast to, as another cruiser example, USS Indianapolis. That isn't to say Helena isn't in good shape. Considering the damage to her hull and the higher level of corrosion, Helena is actually in decent enough condition. In common with other American wrecks, she was identifiable by the hull number on her stern. While rust stains cover it, to some extent, the 50 is still clearly visible. The same goes for the paint around it, which has barely faded over the years. A more interesting feature here comes from the lines still tied to their positions. Those aren't something you see on other wrecks very often. Another thing you don't see often is an open hangar on a cruiser. When it comes to sunken cruisers, they are generally ships that carried their planes in the open, or in superstructure hangars at best. Helena is something different in that she had a hangar mounted in her stern, which is clearly seen here. Petrol never sent their ROV inside ships though, so all we can see is the open maw of the hangar. I would be unsurprised if the ruins of her scouts are still in there for what it's worth. I also doubt they're in very good shape, because the light construction of those aircraft would not have lasted all that well at this depth. What has lasted well, on the other hand, is a 20mm cannon mounted next to the hangar. This gun remains fixed in position, pointing out over the starboard side. The front of the barrel is encrusted with sea life and rust, but the gun is recognizable past that point, right down to still having its ammo box in place, which is fairly rare for this kind of gun, at least on other shipwrecks. Then again, the fact it isn't pointed towards the surface is also pretty rare for 20mm guns on these shipwrecks. On the other hand, the bent gun shield around the weapon is far more typical. The blast shield around the mount, meanwhile, shows little real damage. It isn't particularly dented in or bent, which is rare in its own right. It is, however, heavily rusted, with little of the paint remaining. With how thin the steel is here, I imagine it won't last much longer in comparison to the rest of the ship. That aside, and to round off this picture, you can see what remains of an aircraft crane in the background, along with vent covers. Unfortunately, Petrol didn't take any close-up pictures of that, or, for that matter, the rest of the area around the hangar. They did take a close-up picture of a crab, though. Considering how deep most of the other American wrecks are, at least the famous ones, it's rare to see sea life like that. Ignoring the crab for a moment, the picture is also interesting for being an equally rare close-up of a warship hull. It allows for viewing the rust pattern in more detail, as well as the condition of the paint. Paint that is, all things considered, faring pretty well, at least in this image. Petrol took another picture of what their website called benthic swimming cucumbers while on this topic. While a fascinating image of deep-sea organisms, the wreck behind it is just as interesting. I'm admittedly unsure of which part of the wreck this is, but the preservation is impressive. Much as with the crab picture, you can see where silt and rust is building up, as well as where the paint is being worn away. There is also some debris gathered on the deck, but it's too dark to make out much detail. I think this is near her superstructure, judging from the hull form, but I can't be sure exactly where. Most of the pictures of her wreck are of the aft section, though, so I would guess this is towards the stern. Before I move on to another part of her stern, however, I'll show one more picture of sea life. In this case, glass sponges that seem to have taken up residence on one of her railings. Behind them, Helena's deck is visible beneath accumulated silt and debris. There even seems to be visible deck planking, still intact after decades underwater. That being said, let's move a bit lower on the hull, because here, Helena makes a good comparison to other wrecks. This is because, as I brought up before, getting a good view of the propellers, or screws depending, is rare on a wreck, with the obvious exception, of course, of capsized ships. Helena is a good example of why. Petrol took a picture of one of her starboard screws, and it is buried deeply in the mud. Only one blade is clearly visible, with the rest buried beneath the seafloor. It is most likely the outboard prop on the starboard side, though lack of context clues makes that difficult to say with 100% certainty. Regardless, with this buried in the mud, it shows how these are often hidden from view on more upright shipwrecks. Moving forward a bit from here, we come to her two stern turrets. With the damage to her bow, these are the more intact of Helena's main battery. Unfortunately, Petrol only seems to have taken one image of them, and it's fairly dark. If you look closely, you can see the barbette of the superfiring turret, as well as some of the lower turret and its guns. It is easier to make out the 3 6-inch barrels of the upper turret in this regard. Even there, though, the back of these guns are a bit hard to make out, and the weapons themselves are covered in marine growth. This is another indication of how much difference there is, even in the same ocean, based on how deep a wreck is. Compare that level of growth to, for example, the guns on Lexington. Even so, the guns in their turrets are intact, and still trained out to port. The barrels haven't sagged at all, and the turrets are still as sturdy as the day she sank. At least as far as can be seen in this image. Considering how long she's been underwater, that's impressive to see. Moving past those guns, though, there are only two more things to show on the stern side of her main hull. First, Petrol took a couple close-up shots of Helena's aft gun director. The view from further away shows the director missing parts and covered in rust and marine life. It's hard to make out any specific details for this reason. The frame is recognizable, and the metal isn't completely buried beneath sea life. But beyond that, there's not a lot to point out here for detail work. The closer-in picture, on the other hand, does give at least one detail. Barely visible beneath rusted metal is a plaque. This is her gun director's tag, and in spite of the corrosion around it, the writing is still clearly legible. Navy Bureau, Gun Director, General Electric. And beneath it, another bit of writing that is still readable, but much smaller print. Even on a wreck that's in worse condition, like Helena, American warships still surprise by how much writing has survived the decades underwater. No matter how many times I see it, it never stops surprising me. Or impressing me, for that matter. With that done, however, let's look at the last picture of this section of the ship. This picture is where her stern broke off from the rest of the hull. In some ways, this is a cleaner break than on other wrecks I've covered. In other ways, it is almost worse. The intact section is very intact, but just past that, the deck and hull just kind of vanishes, with only part of it still visible. Not pretty, but at least recognizable, unlike Juno or St. Lo. More interestingly, in Helena's case, this shot is almost a cross-section of her hull. There's the legs of her aft tripod mast, still fixed in place. Taking a quick detour to a photo of the ship in her service career, you can see just how far forward this really is. And, by extension, how much of her stern actually broke off. It's not a small section by any stretch of the imagination. This break is also, roughly, where the damage report indicates the torpedoes hit. So the torn and twisted metal is not terribly surprising. Back to the wreck, though, you can also see doorways that would have been on the interior. One is open, with no sign of its door. The other is still firmly shut, despite both the break in the hull and the decades underwater. It's too bad that Petrel never looked inside that opening, because that open entrance could have shown some fascinating images. However, as I said on my previous wreck video, by no means do I blame them for not trying. This is not the Titanic wreck. That aside, I'll move on to the next set of images now. For the sake of keeping things simple, I'll split this final section in two. First, I'll look at the hull structure, such as it is. Second, I'll look at Helena's remaining weaponry. In the case of the hull structure, there's only one other image here. I'm not sure if Helena's superstructure was just flat out gone, or if Petrel didn't take any pictures of it. Regardless, with a lack of any bridge shots or the like, all that's left is another shot of what was labeled a mast on Allen's website. Judging from the way it looks, this is more likely the lattice structure between her funnels, as seen on this old picture here. I don't see any indication of a traditional mast here, and it's certainly not the tripod at the after end of the wreck. Unfortunately, beyond what is given, it's hard to say much else. I can't tell if this is towards the bow or the stern, or exactly what part of the superstructure the debris is resting on. There aren't any defining features to judge that from, based on this singular image. Which does mean, of course, that it's time to move on. There are only a handful of remaining pictures, consisting of a shot of the one remaining bow turret and one of her 5-inch gun mounts. Let's begin with the main battery turret. Now, the damage that sent Helena to the bottom was severe. Her foremost turret was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed by the first torpedo hit. The second turret was just behind the initial break in the hull, and was not, near as I can tell, photographed. I'm not sure if that's because it fell away as she sank, or because Petrel just didn't take a picture. Looking at the damage report on screen here, I'd be inclined to think it's the former, but I can't be sure. Regardless, the turret on screen here seems to be the number 3 turret. This was the turret closest to her bridge, and is, for the most part, intact. Rusted out and covered in various sea life, but intact nonetheless. Even the sighting hood for the rangefinder is still there, with no visible damage from this angle. However, other than that, not much more can be gleaned from this particular image. So, keeping that in mind, I'll shift to the 5-inch mount now. This mount itself is in similar shape to the 6-inch gun turrets. No major damage, and rusted marine growth aside, easily recognizable. The guns, on the other hand, are not the same story. Leaving aside how encrusted they are pointing skyward. There's a couple reasons this could be the case, though the most obvious example, engaging aircraft, does not apply in this case. Helena was, after all, sunk in a night battle, which is where the first potential answer comes in. The guns could have been elevated with the intention of firing star shells. These were fired high into the air, where a parachute and flare would eject from the shell and illuminate the surroundings. In a night battle, Helena could certainly have been firing those off. Another potential option, though this is less likely, is deterioration or damage to the elevation mechanism. This could result in the gun falling back in the mount, and by extension, elevating skyward. This has happened on Japanese heavy cruiser wrecks, though I don't think any American wrecks have shown similar circumstances. The final option, then, would be the force of the sinking driving the gun skyward. This is certainly a possibility, though without being able to see the other 5-inch mounts, it's difficult to say for sure. As such, star shells are probably the simplest answer. That aside, the final picture here is of the side of the gun mount. Here you can see the access hatch open to the sea, and inside more marine growth, as the sea life around the ship saw this nice enclosed space as a new home. It's an interesting look at how nature reclaims what man built, and one you wouldn't see on deeper wrecks. It is also, however, where this video comes to an end. There were fewer pictures taken, or released in any event, of Helena compared to other wrecks. Even so, this is still a fairly lengthy video, which I know some of my viewers enjoy. The next one, well, we'll see. I'm not sure exactly what next Sunday will entail yet, but that's for future me to decide. For now, I'll leave with this. I covered the wreck of USS Helena today. Tuesday's video will cover the service life of USS Helena. Look forward to that if you're a fan of American cruisers. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.